the back of the seating area at the conclusion of the session. Scan is shut off 15 minutes post-session, so please get your badge scanned before networking with the speakers. Also note that to qualify for CEUs or CPEs, the session must run a full 60 minutes. That 60 minutes can include Q&A, so please have questions ready for the speakers to fill the time requirement. Full details on the continuing education program are available in the TechNet Cyber app and the conference website. Thank you, and now over to our speakers.
Hey, so good afternoon, everyone. So before I get started, just real quick, if you'll just bear with me just a second, I just want to get a count here on industry, government, academia. So just real quick, if you're government, can you just raise your hand? Industry? Woo.
Wow.
Academia? And tired legs, just looking for a seat. All right, awesome. All right. Hey, so yeah, thanks for that. So, so I appreciate you sitting down with us today. What I think is a pretty important conversation. And so, as we look at now, I think I just counted 15 or 16. You have to be acolytes, as you walk away from here to carry the message forward. So please do that for us. So I'm Chris Hollifield. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the Technology Advancement Center. We're a cybersecurity nonprofit. A lot of cool things that we do for the kids, STEM, and workforce development. But one of the big things that we focused on is OT, cybersecurity, and so that's kind of the interest there for us. And when FCA was looking to put this panel on, we jumped on the chance to be part of this conversation. So. Once again, thanks for spending time with us today. So Chuck here, wish we had like a flat Stanley here to put. He's stuck in traffic. Should be here in about 10 minutes. So we'll roll him in when he gets here and do the quick introduction. But here to my right, Corey Simpson, longtime friend, CEO of Grace-Based Strategies, which is a consulting and advisory firm, but also CEO of ICIT, which is a nonprofit, the Institute of Critical Infrastructure. So delighted to have Corey here today for a part of the discussion. And then finally, there on the far end, Ken Wang. He's the Deputy Director of Cybersecurity for DoD Critical Infrastructure, Supply Chain Risk Management, and the Defense Industrial Base. And so that kind of in pecking order falls under the Cyber Warfare Directorate, under OUSD ANS. So looking forward to the conversation today. So before we get into it, just to kind of set strategic context, the problem with, doing these types of engagements is, scoping it appropriately. Because if you keep it too high, it's just a bunch of bumper stickers. It's, platitudes that really doesn't drive anything. But what we would really like to walk away with is some, tangible thoughts that, as we, kind of high five from TechNet Cyber at the end of this, some things that we can, carry forward as, effects that we can generate. So, that is where we really want to drive the conversation today. As I look at, the past 10 or 15 years, we've definitely seen the scope, scale, and agility of our adversaries has increased, exponentially. What once took, nation-state resources 10 to 15 years ago, now, any script kiddie in their mom's basement can do kind of the same thing. And so, that's why, we can't boil the ocean. We've really got to look at how we focus on the most pressing problems. And then, in particular, as we look at, where we're at with AI, the problem becomes even more. So to kind of kick things off, and I'll kick this to Corey first, if you're good with it.
Yeah.
Awesome. As you look at kind of the problem space, how do you scope the problem in terms of, threats and opportunities?
It's great to be with you. Thanks, Chris. Ken, it's good to be with you. Y'all, thanks for joining. In terms of context, so the Institute of Critical Infrastructure Technology is a membership of about 50,000 across the United States, and we focus on critical infrastructure that provides for foundational need. And I'll tell you, the overlap with that infrastructure which we define as energy, water and wastewater, and then what we call TNT, transportation and telecoms. Think transportation of data, and then transportation of goods, physical ones, because when things go wrong, you have to be able to call, and then you have to be able to get people out of situations or get something to them. So as we have looked at that space, and we think of it through the lens of the U.S. government. The U.S. government looks at critical infrastructure through it, as it should, a national security lens. And when you apply that lens, you're thinking power projection, nuclear deterrence, force mobility. It's the same infrastructure that we rely on in the civilian sector. And some of the complexity with that is critical infrastructure is everything and therefore nothing. We recently stood up a center for the Federal Civilian Executive Branch Resilience. How many folks know what the FCB is, the FCIB? Daryl, you can't. All right. So there's a few. I spent 23 years in uniform, and I didn't know what it was until I got out. So it's essentially all the civilian agencies that are not in the national security community, so not a part of the IC or Department of Defense. So it's 102 dogs and cats that have very diffuse congressional oversight and very diffuse mission sets, and they don't necessarily talk to one another. And that's just within the U.S. government side. When you look on the civilian sector, they operate for 75+% of critical infrastructure that we rely upon is owned and operated by the private sector. They're profit-driven, as they should be. And so when you look at that, the motivations of the U.S. government and the different pieces of it, either regulating or interfacing with critical infrastructure owners and operators, the various owners and operators of critical infrastructure, everybody just has different equities and different perspectives. The challenge with that becomes, if you're China looking at us, and make no mistake about it, they're in phase 0, shaping operations. And so I think the U.S. should probably think about that next phase, deterrence. And what does deterrence mean in this space? We talk a lot in the military, at least, through deterrence by cost imposition. Well, there's a whole other side of that coin, which is deterrence by denial. And in this space, deterrence by denial means strengthening your resiliencies, your ability to recover from incidents, and planning and conducting coordinated, pre-crisis exercises that involve all stakeholders. And when I say all stakeholders, we have to expand that aperture a little bit, because we've been thinking about it only in terms of, who does this planning, who can we get to this event, and we haven't been really incorporating in sort of that whole of government and then whole of nation approach that it takes to truly make critical infrastructure resilient. So I think the threat is one in which, lots of open source reporting on it. It's both in the 2024 annual threat assessment, the 2025 annual threat assessment. China's all over critical infrastructure, and they have placement and access with disruptive capabilities. We know that. That's a fact. What we need to start doing is coming together as a community and preparing to deter that. And deterrence in this space is deterrence by denial, focusing on resilience, our ability to recover. And that means that we've got to start conducting exercise. That's sort of threats, opportunities, and I think sort of a high-level perspective.
Yep, no, that makes sense. So Ken, I'll kind of come to you with the same question to see, on the Venn diagram, do we kind of see it the same? Because we've got a good, representation here from, nonprofit, from government. Do we see it the same on the Venn diagram?
Yeah, he covered it. I'm done.
Yeah.
No, Corey, that was a very articulate way of presenting things with regards to the threat and opportunities. From the DoD perspective, and from specifically in cyber warfare, how we look at threats and opportunities, or how we frame things, is we look at cyber risk to mission. And really, that's how we kind of frame things. How does our adversary put our missions at risk through cyberspace? what we use is called the mission stack. Think of a layer cake, right? Where the top layer or the frosting, right, is your mission owners. That's your combatant commanders, your component commanders, followed by the layer below is the missions that they own. And then below that is the weapons and platforms that perform those missions. And then the network that kind of like holds it all together. And below that is DoD critical infrastructure. And below that is the commercial critical infrastructure to include the defense industrial base. So through that stack, our adversaries can affect our mission by attacking anywhere in that stack or in that layer cake. They can hit our weapon systems. They can hit our critical infrastructure to shut down fuel that supplies our aircraft, for instance. That's a way to look at how our adversaries can affect us and what our risks are. Now, when I look at that, I'm not focused on the top part because my job is to focus on the lower half of the cake. The DoD critical infrastructure, the DIB, the commercial critical infrastructure. And I look at it from a supply chain perspective, right? So when I look at the lower half of that cake, supply chain to me means three areas. Essentially, commodities, which, really talks about the utilities. As Corey mentioned, power, water, fuel, those are key things that are being provided to an installation. It's a supply that's getting there. Then you have products and services, things that you would imagine. Fighter aircraft, ships, beans, bullets, Band-Aids, those type of things, products and services that are being provided to the warfighter, right? And then finally, logistics or transportation. And this all kind of aligns with what Corey had mentioned earlier. It's how I get raw materials to the producer, to a distributor, to the front line, right? So we're looking at, instead of those nodes, we're looking at the links. How do I protect cyber from affecting that? How do I keep, a ship from going to, instead of going to Germany, going to Spain, right? Where Spain is not where we want to deliver equipment, materials, and supplies to the warfront. We want to put it in Germany, for instance. So given that, looking at the entire set, what are the levers that I have or the things that I can affect? And I've also kind of categorized them as people, policy and processes, technology, and of course resources, because I can't do anything without money, right? And that's a challenge for a critical infrastructure because from the DoD perspective, visibility and understanding from senior leadership is a challenge because the assumption is that, that's always going to be there. I need to focus on my, shiny objects. I want to be able to get my fighter jets forward. I want to be able to project forces. But if you don't have that critical infrastructure as your foundation, you're done. So, the other thing I wanted to kind of share is and I'm trying to lay the landscape out for you, is that we have three different types of terrains. Cyber terrains, clear that up. So everyone's familiar with enterprise IT. So that's your traditional IT, computers, routers, et cetera, telecom. But there's two other pieces that are missing there. One is weapon systems, and the other is operational technology, things that support, like industrial control systems, things that support the critical infrastructure, things that manage processes. Those three areas are very, very different, and that applying controls in one area does not necessarily apply to the other. So I just wanted to share that and keep that in the forefront as we continue our discussions. And I think Corey summarized the threat as very clearly that our adversaries, and I'll say it, China and Russia, are very good and have been studying us for years. and we'll get to my concerns later on in as we close out. So I'll leave it there.
So what I just heard was, from Corey, I thought it was well laid out. And it's about deterrence, right? I mean, deterrence is readiness. And then I tie to that what you just described about, how we can look at lines of effort to go after the problems. You talked about people, processes, technology, and resources. So kind of in that vein, as we kind of carry this to maybe the next discussion point, where do you see gaps or seams between the different entities within the ecosystem, government, industry, academia, and there's a lot of complexity in that. It's not pure. But where do you identify gaps or seams that are critical to fix right now? And I'll start with Ken. And before I go to you, Ken, this is Chuck, everybody.
Howdy. Say hi to Chuck.
Yep, he doing very important business, stuck in traffic. But Chuck here is public sector CTO at Drago, so super delighted to have him here today. So what you've missed so far is really a strategy of deterrence, and then kind of as we're scoping the problem, and then maybe what are the lines of effort kind of that we would need to approach to go after this problem, whether it's people, processes, technology, or resources, as described. So, before I turn it over to you, Ken, kind of that next one, I'd like to give Chuck here the opportunity to talk how you see scoping the problem, understanding we can't boil the ocean.
Sure. So first, I think it's important to take actions on deterrence that actually work. Because what we have done thus far, up until now, has really not been very successful. We still have the PRC, other adversaries that are inside of our infrastructure, that are still actively targeting our infrastructure, and it's obvious we need to kind of shift that paradigm, right? So when I think about this problem from a scoping perspective, it kind of depends on which lens we're talking about. From a DoD standpoint, our role as the Department of Defense, and the role of the Department of Defense, not obviously speaking on behalf of the DoD, is to defend the U.S. and U.S. persons against foreign threats. That's why folks who are in the service, who are civil servants, raised their right hand. It wasn't to kind of do a normal day-to-day job. It was really to defend against foreign adversaries. There's just not enough of us to do that at the scale that our adversaries are compromising us right now. So for the DoD, I believe the DoD should look to prioritize things aligned to mission, aligned to power projection, and that includes both inside and outside the wire critical infrastructure that support those mission sets. For the longest, I think a lot of folks have focused on the inside the wire piece as the kind of most important. However, what we're seeing and what multiple engagements and conversations have kind of stumbled across is that the outside the wire is really kind of that soft underbelly, right? And I don't think it's fair that in those situations that a U.S. citizen should be expected to defend themselves against a foreign military, against a nation state. So we've got to kind of look to, how we leverage resources, how we align to kind of that line of effort, right? To where we're, applying dollars, applying people, time, energy, talent to the areas of greatest risk, as well as the areas that are most critical for mission execution.
So, quick follow-on question, and Ken, I swear I'll come back to you.
No, good.
So, Chuck has a lot of experience, not just on the U.S. side, but NATO and NATO partner side. So, what you just described, kind of this breaking of the link between, prioritizing, our high-priority mission space, power projection. Do you see do you see a similar issue with, our allies and partners in that space? Is it a consistent trend that you see? Because at some point we have to work with them, right? So is that consistent?
Yeah, no, I think it is. The challenges that you have in areas like NATO are that they are not, obviously a single country. So if they have mission sets that extend across multiple countries, what you will see is that one country may implement security and security controls in one way. Another that's right next to them for the same mission set may implement things that are entirely different. So it becomes a much bigger challenge to get kind of cohesive action and consensus. And it doesn't work perfectly because that's the real world, right? Like not everybody wants to work with each other. It is a challenge. And then we also have a challenge in just kind of decision making, risk to life, risk to mission over profit, which is the same kind of trend across both board. We're prioritizing convenience, prioritizing dollars because these are private businesses in many cases we're talking about. And pointing to NATO, I think a great example, an article the other day talks about how they're contracting with a company whose ownership is directly associated with the PRC Army to build a wind farm that's going to provide power for NATO mission sets. That's a little wild.
Agreed. So as we continue on the conversation, I know you'll have all the answers how to fix this in the future. So we'll get to that. But I want to pivot back to Ken to kind of go the next evolution of where we're taking the conversation, which is, as we look at the ecosystem, where do you identify gaps and seams that we really should focus on? What are the pressing areas that we collectively in the ecosystem need to focus?
So, looking at, from the government perspective to industry and academia, one of the things that we have a challenge of doing is articulating our requirements. Telling...
You're saying on the government side?
On the government side, yeah.
Okay.
Articulating our requirements to industry and to academia, which, industry... In critical infrastructure, industry is what drives the innovation. It's not DoD. So we need to articulate our requirements so that industry and academia can innovate to our needs, right? And then one of the other pieces, when we talk about academia is, workforce development. Workforce development is key. It's a gap in the fact that there's probably, besides Chuck, myself, and Daryl, who's sitting out in the audience, we make up probably about half of the folks in DoD that really understand the critical infrastructure and cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. So, and I'm exaggerating. Obviously, there's much more people. No, but again, this is a very small set of folks. And if we're to do this mission, we need to expand that workforce. Without that workforce, you can bring in all the technology you want. If you don't have the workforce to operate it, it's not going to work. Or the money. The last piece is the money. We need money to do this. And we just cannot get visibility and essentially acknowledgement at senior leadership levels to move the resources to get to do what we need to do to deter and defend our critical infrastructure.
Yeah. Corey, kind of same question to you. You're coming from a broad experience, but as you look at kind of from the nonprofit. And then your military time. What do you see as the gaps and seams?
Yeah, I think starting big to small. So at the highest level, I think, and the most strategic, like grand strategy, national misalignment, or national seam, if you will, or international for that matter. When the United States thinks about using cyber power, and you think of it as an element of national power, where do we bend it? Diplomatic, information, military, economic. We bend it. I'm sitting up here with, heavy DoD. We bend it military. How does China bend it? Information or economic? And I think that misalignment in how we think about leveraging cyber, especially as we just engaged in economic warfare with China, you're probably going to see them leveraging cyber as a capability more frequently. So one, I think that's a seam or a gap that we should probably start working to address, or at least understanding, I think from a global and an international perspective. Drawing down to, say, the national level, there are various actors in the ecosystem. We talked about that, various actors represented on this stage. But the differences when it comes to critical infrastructure they're not subtle, they're structural. And they're structural for very good reason. We've long attempted, albeit imperfectly, to separate military and civilian infrastructure. Like I said, there's a lot of really good traditions for that. When you think about LOAC, international humanitarian law, and you're targeting, you want your military assets distinct from your civilian populations. What have we done with our critical infrastructure? All of those bases, all those military assets rely on critical infrastructure. And as systems become more interconnected, more attached, our adversaries know that, and they're exploiting those seams. And I think we at ICIT get a unique perspective because we work across government, industry, academia, civil society, and where we see systems that fail to function as a whole, I believe it can largely be broken into to three big buckets. One is the regulatory fragmentation, just how we govern different sections of what we consider critical infrastructure. It wouldn't be a panel on critical infrastructure security in policy and contextualization without mentioning the need to harmonize, right? Like, it's been a big effort. It's been underway for years. We need to do that. We need to prioritize that effort. We need to give clear requirements to industry that they can follow in different sectors, and we need to better understand where there's dual, triple, quadruple, and Chuck, I'm sure you could tell stories of a lot more than double or triple, but there's a lot of misalignment, and that creates a lot of burn and a lot of seams. And then I think there's operational gaps between the government and private owners and operators. The government relies, I think a full stop after this, the government relies on civilian critical infrastructure to project power. Full stop. And so we need to better understand and prioritize those dependencies for power projection, and then figure out how we can better incorporate I would say deterrence measures, or whether that's deterrence by denial or being very clear to would-be adversaries. If you target these things, there will be consequences. I was a part of an organization it's 5 years ago now, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission brought together a whole bunch of folks, looked at this problem, included the director of the FBI, the deputy of Homeland, Intel, Defense, senators, congressmen, 6 of the best experts in the world. And at that time, we were uncomfortable drawing red lines, saying if you target these things, like, the U.S. will respond. So we left that, if you notice in the report, very open. 5 years later, I believe we need to do a much better job at saying these things are off the table, and there will be consequences, so cost and position, if these things are targeted by adversaries. And then I think probably the most pressing fix that we all can play a part of is a cultural one, where we treat critical infrastructure as adjacent to the mission, but not as a part of it. That mindset shift needs to happen. We need to start thinking of it as vital to the mission. And once it does, we need to draw a whole of government, whole of nation strategy on the government side, linking DoD, DOT, DHS, CISA, all the different dogs and cats, together with industry, and then have shared operational planning, integrated response frameworks, and then targeted investments in these systems that enable our national mobility. So that's kind of I think at the
so good. So on that last point, do you envision like a NSC led campaign, like a critical infrastructure cybersecurity campaign? I mean, is that an answer to that?
There's been a lot of different recommendations. I do think there needs to be something probably at the White House level, whether that sits in, as an element of the NSC, whether that's in
DNI
or the Office of the National
ONCD.
Cyber, or like, OSTP. There's a lot of entities in the White House that are dual-hatted as part of the NSC and then as a part of the regular course of business, and so they can essentially respond to crisis, but also help set policy at the presidential level. I think that's the level we're talking about because you've got to pull so much together.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me the audible there. So, Chuck, coming to you, and as kind of you go through the same question, I would be interested in your perspective on kind of what Ken mentioned on. I don't know how you articulated it, but it was the government doesn't drive innovation, doesn't have the market cornered on innovation. Just being interested in your thought on that.
Yeah, so the government doesn't have the market cornered, period, anymore. The government is not a large enough buyer at scale to actually make, in many cases, its desired requirements stick. And that's provided those requirements are right in the first place and actually address the problem that needs to get addressed. So when you talk about harmonization, we don't have, depending on where you are, the same understanding of the problem that everyone else has. For example, folks on the IT side who are struggling with the OT cyber problem may be more inclined to focus on vulnerabilities, because that's a quantifiable thing that's very easy to track, and you can put it on a chart, and you can brief that very easily. However, vulnerabilities are not the thing that the adversary necessarily requires to conduct their operations. So that leads to the whole discussion around how do we align resourcing. It needs to be against a threat to a mission, which I see folks struggle to do just because of the way that budgeting, palm cycling, things like that occur within the DoD. So workforce, right? Workforce is an interesting challenge. I've seen schools stand up OT cybersecurity programs to build people, but then those people go out and they don't have jobs because nobody's hiring. Why isn't anybody hiring? That's a really interesting question. Perhaps it's worth exploring tying a requirement to have X number of cybersecurity people in order to receive a grant from CISA or from other government agencies. We have to, sometimes regulatory doesn't work. Sometimes there are other levers that can be pulled and explored. And I feel like folks are not necessarily exploiting those gaps, right? Exploiting those opportunities. When we think about public-private partnerships, we're not very good at acknowledging that everybody's perspective and needs are different. We build these grand concepts of public-private partnerships to, blanket apply to everybody. Well, as a private industry, I need dollars. Like, dollars are what allows me to execute a mission as a private organization dedicated to safeguarding civilization. If I'm approached by 10 different government organizations who all say, we want to partner, can you give us your info? Can we establish collaborative agreements, but there's not going to be any money associated with them? I may not have time to support those. If I have paying mission partners, that will, by nature of being a business, take priority. So that is a gap that nobody has really fully fleshed out. Is we know that private industry has value. I don't think that within the DoD or government we quite know what that partnership could look like. We've seen some great examples like the Volt Typhoon, Microsoft, government interactions, right? The case study that Dragos published with Littleton Light and Power up in Massachusetts, and the government involvement and interactions there have been phenomenal, but those have not scaled yet. And so I think we need to look at the things that really work and that achieve an operational outcome and focus on like expanding those types of things to maybe try to build a framework that addresses that gap. The regulatory, the regulatory space is interesting. We've seen some phenomenal successes, honestly, in the electric sector with industry actually buying into things that are coming out of FERC. Like we've watched NERC actually vote, and the utilities themselves say, yes, we want to require ourselves to install monitoring capabilities down to the substation level. Like that's really exciting. But not every industry has the ability to self-fund themselves. Like the electric community kind of has this ability to rate recover depending on what state, territory they may be in, but water does not. So we sometimes try to reach for like a broad strategic solution where it's not going to shake out and it's not going to work out. And so we may just need to kind of like look at smaller pieces of the ecosystem to approach, kind of in parallel, perhaps.
So you're thinking small pilot efforts.
So when we say pilots, we typically think about, hey, we're trying to prove something out. We're trying to do this. We already know what works against our adversaries. It's wild to me that we've known what makes our adversaries' lives difficult for several years now. And yet we continue to invest in other things because other things are sometimes easier to implement. Maybe they have a higher chance of success at complete project completion, and we're driven as people, like we like to be successful, right? But I think that there are some easy things we could do that will generate immediate successes, and there's probably some harder stuff that's going to take time, and there will be some failure, but we don't have to do pilots because we already know the answers to the test. We just need to execute the things that we know will make our adversaries' lives harder.
So there any things in the future, that as you think through it, that, at the end of the day, we want to be able to outmaneuver our adversaries, right? As you kind of project ahead to the future, where do we need to posture to set conditions so that we can kind of outmaneuver?
So first, we got to have people to the problem. So this goes back. It's not just enough to have a workforce. You have to have a workforce that's actually assigned to something that's part of the problem set. What we're experiencing right now in a lot of different places is you'll have dual-hatted folks, like a person that's the cyber person, also is the HR person, also is the person that's responsible for mowing the lawn on Fridays at their local municipality-owned utility. That's a true role, right? Like I know a person who lives all three of those hats. If you're not dedicated to a problem, you're not focused on the problem. It's the same thing for if the DoD is looking to really engage in a meaningful way. Unless we put specific people to specific things, specific outcomes are not going to happen. That is also one of the challenges that I see between the policy, the strategy, the policy, and the operational execution spaces, is that the folks that sit at the strategy level may not actually have the same understanding of what their strategy is going to lead to as the folks that are thinking about this at the operational execution level. This actually goes back to military decision-making process, right? Where if you have less time, you have to be more directive. I think we are in that space right now. And from the top down, we should seek to provide more specified and specific guidance to the field about what to do. Time now.
Well said. Corey, coming to you, as you look at the future, what concerns you that we really need to think through how we posture for advantage?
Yeah, it's starting on the concern side of the house. I would say a strategic concern is we know that there have been shaping operations conducted against the United States by the CCP. I think we need to get more serious about deterrence on that. And I think until we're able to do that and sort of figure out how best to do that, it seems unlikely at this point that prevention or defense is likely.
So, can I
Sure.
grab the mic for just a second? So the Air Force Research Lab did a webinar like 2 or 3 years ago, and the presenter was a PhD level cyber scientist, right? He was an engineer plus cyber, had a doctorate. So this is not Chuck making this up. The statement he made was every single prevention capability that's ever been made has already been compromised. Every prevention capability that will be made, the adversary will compromise. So when we talk about deterrence, prevention, I just see that as an opportunity to make the adversary work harder. But if we're going to really deter them, that's a mixture of cost imposition and making their lives difficult, which sometimes are the same thing, but sometimes they can be just a little bit nuanced. And again, doing things that make them go, oh, there's going to be a consequence for anybody that has children, right? Consequence is kind of the big word of the day. My daughter's 5, and we're going through the struggle right now. If you don't put a consequence against something, and a consequence that actually works, your deterrence strategy is not deterrence, it's just platitudes.
My daughter is 20, and we're still having that consequence.
Yeah.
My daughter's 4, and she doesn't understand consequences. So.
So that's a really good point. The same consequence doesn't work for the same situation for the same people. And we also usually try to do a blanket approach on some of this stuff, which has been proven to not be effective. So thank you guys for that example and reminder.
We're here to support you, Chuck.
Yeah. So I think, and I do, just to get on the deterrence thread, the other side of the deterrence by cost imposition, deterrence by denial in this space means resilience, I believe. The ability to recover when, the higher fences, the stronger locks fail, we're able to get back to mission and we're able to do it quickly. I think another concern is the expanding attack surface and the uneven defense. I know that this is, sort of a panel meant on transportation or military readiness, the ability to project power, military mobility. When you look at transportation networks, they're becoming more digitized, they're becoming more automated, they're becoming more connected. And as that happens, our attack surface expands. You're drawing a whole bunch of different dogs and cats together and plugging them up to machines that are running, carrying people. And these things, we don't fully understand, one, how to defend them, but there's markets for them. And so we're unveiling them and we're rolling them out, and our adversaries certainly know. And if they didn't know post the CrowdStrike incident, just in terms of scale, as everybody know, the CrowdStrike incident that occurred this summer that incident, in perspective, it was less than 1% of Windows machines globally. It cost the Fortune 500. It was down for 90 minutes. It cost the Fortune 500 $5.5 billion. That's a pretty good, if you do a Carver analysis, right, targeting methodology, applies some numbers, the last R in the Carver recognizability. Like we've consolidated our infrastructure in a few key spots, and now there's a pretty good indicator of what happens if you impact less than 1% of that for less than 2 hours. So I think that's something that we need to start understanding. And then I think the risk of strategic paralysis as something, a rapidly unfolding crisis occurs. So sort of what we've all been talking about, there's so many different dogs and cats in this. If the pre-positioned access is flipped, systems start going down, it's going to take a whole bunch of people that don't normally work together in a crisis environment to come together and solve that problem. I think we need to start thinking about that. Because I spent a long time in a crisis response force. Rehearsals are vital. You can't just do it when the thing is needed. You spend the overwhelming majority of your life preparing for a very brief moment in time. And then I would say, how should we posture now? We need to start thinking about elevating transportation nodes as strategic national assets, identifying those, and then putting targeted resources behind protecting them. I think we need to look at integrated infrastructure dependencies into our operational exercises. We do a lot of exercises, especially in the Department of Defense. I think if we can start incorporating those cross-sector dependencies, that systems of systems connected to other systems that rely on other systems, we need to start looking at that as we do these exercises. And then for an investment perspective, we need to invest in resilience as strategic deterrence. But it's also and there's more, it's a public good, right? If you make infrastructure more secure, those same transportation nodes, those same water sources, those same energy grids support everyday Americans. You're making everyday Americans' lives better. So there's dual good in that, and I think that's something that is worthy of investment.
So on your exercise comment, I'm going to white card that. We've got to stop allowing that. For those of y'all who don't know, a white card is where you just kind of these are not the droids you're looking for over a problem. We need to force our warfighters to actually work through the problem in these very costly exercises and acknowledge that maybe they won't be able to, but we're going to learn from it.
So I want to make sure we've got enough time for questions at the end. So Ken, I'll start with you. As we kind of wind down day one here. We've talked through kind of a bunch of different topics, but what's your call to action? As you think through the kind of your closing point, how do you want to leave it? What's the call to action?
Well, so first, I just want to quick touch on concerns that build on everything that my colleagues here have said. And, our adversaries have been studying us. They've been studying us for a long time. My biggest concern is that while we are focused on the obvious, this is all tied to the dependency, the obvious threat vectors coming in, that we're not seeing the other stuff. So I'm going to use a dinosaur analogy just to make things interesting. So who's seen Jurassic Park? The first one, right? Come on. All right. So do you remember when that hunter or the Australian hunter, he said, okay, these velociraptors, they will come at you face first, and then their partners are going to hit you from the side. That's what I'm worried about with China and Russia, because you're looking at the critical infrastructure, and they're looking at something else that's ancillary to that, but they've already determined the dependency. We may not have determined that. While we're focused on the critical infrastructure, they're looking at another key piece over to the side and then hitting us that way. That's my concern, is that we haven't looked at sufficiently, worked through all of it as much as our adversaries have. So with that, the call to arms, okay, from DoD's perspective and where I sit is to inform and educate our senior leadership. All right, because in order to get resources to get after these issues of the people issue, the technology issue, the process issue, we need resources and we need advocacy for senior leadership. So from my perspective, that's the call to arms. We need to be able to come at senior leadership within DoD from both within the DoD, the department itself, but also from industry and academia. It has to be a multi-pronged effort to get them to understand that, their their assumption that the critical infrastructure is stable is absolutely false. So with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Corey?
Sure. So I am blessed at ICIT to work with a great team. They send me nowhere without remarks. I don't always do a great job of looking at those remarks, but I'm going to for this question, largely because it fits nicely that I'm sitting up here with 3 girl dads. But I'll say Alain de Botton, a modern philosopher and writer, once described parenting as the art of constantly breaking bad news without destroying all confidence and hope. So that's not a bad description of the art of national security leadership. So here's the hard truth. Our adversaries have the placement and access to disrupt us before a fight begins. They're targeting the infrastructure that moves, feeds, and sustains our force. But here's the confidence. We can still outmaneuver them, but we have to move together. My call to action is this. Let's stop planning in isolation, start rehearsing as a single team. That means real cyber mobility tabletop exercises with DoD, DHS, DOT, CISA, industry, all the different dogs and cats at the same table. It means expanding cybersecurity grants to the transportation lifelines we depend on, ports, rails, local operators. It means pushing for harmonized standards and empowering regional info sharing hubs. Critical infrastructure cybersecurity isn't someone else's problem. It's a shared fight. And winning requires every link of the chain. In the context of defending critical infrastructure, peace through strength means resilience. It's deterrence by denial, and it's the phase of the operation we're in today. And we need to start acting like it. The seams are visible, but so too are the solutions. It's going to take a whole of government and a whole nation effort to close the gaps. That work is underway today, and I hope that all of you will join us in that effort.
All right, here's the fun part. So I'm going to kind of split this into targeted for groups. So if you're a warfighter and you're down at the point of execution, I want you to start asking questions. How does my food that I eat get to my table? How does the fuel that my trucks rely on get to the fuel depot where I then drive to go pick it up? Because understanding how things work, some people call it mission decomposition, mission analysis, that's going to be a strategic difference maker in the upcoming conflict. Because we may all have to do things that are a little bit outside of our comfort zone. And if you know how things work, you might be able to actually make some type of meaningful impact. If you don't, appreciate you very much and go, sit on the curb because we don't want you electrocuting yourself, right? So that's to that group. Writ large, one of my largest strategic concerns right now is the fact that we cannot tell if it was cyber or not cyber. So let's take a look at Spain and Portugal, right? They had an incident. There were small mass outages, right? And nobody had the visibility or understanding of the system to fully be able to quantify, was it only natural? Was it cyber enabled with natural? Was it all cyber? We don't know. So when we think about things like zero trust, when we think about conflict, when we think about just living day to day, being able to see is really important, right? If we cannot answer the question, was it cyber or not cyber, how can we expect our utilities, our engineers to actually be able to restore systems if the environment could be contested? That is something they need to know about, right? So, Dragos, of course, visibility, Rob, but honestly, strategically, being able to answer that question is so important right now. It's so important.
Thanks, Chuck. All right, so that's kind of what we had for, I guess, our prepared questions and remarks. So what are your questions? Sandy?
We have 5 minutes to fulfill that requirement that young lady was saying.
Called out, huh? I'm Sandy Radesky. I'm Associate Director of Vulnerability Management at CISA. We focus on software security and run the CV program and do many assessments in critical infrastructure. And so what I was wondering is, from your perspectives, do you think that we have all of the authorities that we need to do this in a crisis, thinking of your crisis situation, Corey, to be able to recover? I think we, as you all said, the adversary is already in our critical infrastructure networks. They have access. It's really going to be about prioritizing the right entities to work with and to be there ready to help recover. And a lot of the challenges that we have from a CISA perspective today is, the work with these entities is voluntary, and there's a lot of liability in working with some of the entities when it comes to a recovery standpoint. So I know what my answer would be, but I'm interested in what your thoughts are.
Yeah, you guys mind if I take it?
Oh, yeah.
So authorities do nothing for you if you have OGCs that are preventing you from executing those authorities. We have to stop being more afraid of ourselves and make the adversary afraid of us. And we should be more afraid of the adversary than we are afraid of ourselves as well. So I think if you look across the spectrum, there's all sorts of ways to get things done. But today, many people are handcuffed by risk-adverse leadership and by general counsels that are focused and believe we're still living in peacetime and not in crisis.
But do you think that some authorities would help to kind of break through that culture?
So more specified authorities.
There you go.
If you make it specific, they can't find a way around it.
I'm speaking of recovery. I've spent 30 years as an attorney in the U.S. government. I've spent about a decade of that doing organized crime and drug enforcement work, and then another couple decades in the special operations community. Looking at the critical infrastructure space, one, I don't think it's an authorities problem. I think you have all the authorities that you need. I know CISA is very fond of going back and asking for more every time they're granted more. At some point, I think they need to start exercising the authority that they have. I also think on the recovery side, fortunately, the U.S. government, every breach of the U.S. government that we know of has been for the purposes of espionage. So state and local governments have been facing disruptive attacks for years. The U.S. government hasn't. I think when a disruptive, because I do think it's a win, when a disruptive attack does occur, I don't think the response will be limited. You'll be surprised how people come together in crisis and things get approved pretty quickly. The risk tolerance goes up, my experience anyway, pretty dramatically.
I also think that in crisis, that you're going to have a lot of people just pitching in and doing the right thing. Just as citizens of the United States, and people of the world, we have a responsibility to our communities, no matter what role we've got. And I will never count, I'll use a Rob Lee quote, my CEO, I'll never count America out, right? As long as we have our people involved in the fight.
All right, last question.
Very good.
You have the honor.
So thank you very much, sir. Hey, thank you everybody here at the panel for all of your strategic insights and whatnot. John Diedenhofen, AFC Las Vegas chapter president. A couple things. You did talk a lot about strategic deterrence and these sort of things. So at the operational and the tactical levels, certainly we're looking at detection. We're looking at incident response. We're doing things like that. One of the things I sort of heard here was that also we need to get a lot bit smarter on forensics analysis to be able to form senior level leadership that yes, indeed, this was a cyber attack. And yes, indeed, these individuals, these groups, these threat actors were the ones that executed that. So then you could then perhaps take those strategic actions in order to hold these bad actors accountable. Is that a fair assumption that we need to ramp up our at the operational and tactical level? So we need to ramp up our ability to perform those sorts of forensic analyses and attribution.
So I'll tackle it from the technical perspective, and I'll let y'all talk on the strategic pain. On the technical perspective, we need the OEMs to actually build capabilities that enable forensics. If anybody's ever looked at a programmable logic controller, it's the thing that tells things what to do, right? To do forensics on that, you have to open up the case, alligator clip some things onto a board, pray that you don't get electrocuted while you're doing it, and then you have to know how the memory of that device is structured and all sorts of other things. It's really hard. We should talk to the OEMs. Maybe that's a thing CISA could do, right? Maybe bring the OEMs together and say, hey, we need basic capabilities to do these 5 things. Keep it simple. From a technical perspective, that would enable the field and really probably help make everybody's lives easier.
So from my perspective, I don't need attribution. I just need to know intent. Was it malicious or not malicious? That's enough for me to move out on. Right? So that's how I'm going to answer that question. All I need is intent.
Good to go.
I think for a cost imposition perspective, if you're looking at it as a national level, attribution becomes pretty important. And I think it's not probably even just national attribution. You probably need to start. We have been talking about attribution for a long, long time at many, many different levels. Certainly on the allied side of the house, say Western democracies broadly, about hey, how do we do this to come together to say we're not going to tolerate these things? Well, first we got to know who did the thing.
That's right.
Yeah. So.
I would also foot stomp that in the immediacy of response, that attribution is not as important as understanding what impacts occurred. But the problem that we face, like I said, is that if that impact was cyber and I'm replacing a piece of equipment because I've built backup stocks to be more resilient, right? If I'm putting that on a compromised network and it just gets compromised again 30 seconds later, eventually my bench stocks are going to dwindle down. So I would say attribution important strategically, knowing, again, cyber, not cyber, important locally.
All right, so I think that concludes our panel today. Appreciate you spending the last hour with us. So here's your safety brief. Don't drink and drive. Don't drink and swim. Don't swim and drive. All right, everybody have a good night.